All right, we're back. Thank you everyone for finding this video. I appreciate your diligence and your patience. And I just wanted to let you know, as always, if you have any questions, you can contact me. Email's a good way, but we can find other ways as well. All right, so what I'm going to do is just kind of go through this and assume you can pause, go back, you can ask questions if you like, and I'll do the best I can with this. So what we're starting here is another mini unit in our discrimination unit, which will finish up the unit on discrimination. So we're going to take a look at race and ethnicity. We've been looking at nationality. So now we're going to take a look at race. And I think maybe one of the best ways of explaining to you at least the historical orientation of the concept of race from an American perspective is to say it this way, that race in America is one of the major stories. It's one of our major narratives. It has shaped who we are in so many profound ways. And that, of course, has a bearing on how we look at the Constitution and how Supreme Court justices look at administering the law and what the law is and who we are as human beings. So that's always shifting. It's always changing. And when you have, 340 million Americans, of course, you're going to have different opinions. Some might be based on science, some just tradition or ignorance, and so the law is in there somewhere. And so our job is not to look at everything, but to understand some of the basic aspects, the forces that sort of expose the interplay between cultural attitudes and constitutional history. So in order to do that, I wanted to just mention that this concept of race is not the only way of talking about ethnicity, but we're going to focus on that just for now. Race is a concept, right? It's an idea. And that idea, just like any idea, has an origin or several origins. It's not always been around, and it's not always going to be around, but it is now. And we can kind of trace its origins to about the beginning of the 19th century. A lot of things were going on that will explain that, which we're not going to get into, but I'll just tell you very briefly that there was a renewed interest in science. America was born in this cauldron of the Enlightenment, where we were considering new thoughts and new ways of looking at nature. And the scientific revolution had a tremendous bearing on how we look at natural rights and what is a human being. John Locke himself is really kind of in the midst of this and struggling with what does it mean to be a person if you look very different and sound very different from an Englishman, for example. And he made some sort of ham-fisted attempts to explain why Africans deserve to be enslaved. So we're not going to go down that rabbit trail, but it's fascinating to look at that. A lot of the framers of the Constitution were morally conflicted about these things. They had these new attitudes towards science and these traditions, and many of them were extremely bright people, and many of them some of the most learned people in the West. But they still struggled with these things. I don't want to put them into the category that they're all racist, period, or that they were all like they could do no wrong. They were kind of complicated. All right. So probably the best way to dive into this is to talk about this early 19th century, late 17th century, late 18th century Enlightenment concept known as race. All right. So about by that time, many learned people in Europe and eventually in the colonies. Some of the smartest people, most learned people were looking to science and anthropology to help us to understand what it means to be a person, because this has a bearing on rights, right, which is really important. So it's sort of one of the basic concepts of American democracy. So they were looking at all these different kinds of people around the world, and they said, well, they look different. They look different on the surface. Their skin is different. They speak different languages. They have different cultures. We're not all the same, but there was definitely a family similarity. And so the scientific consensus by the early 19th century was, yeah, those things are pretty superficial. Is there some structural difference? Is there something below the skin that makes us all different? And if that's the case, then some maybe are more capable of living in civilization than others. And so they started looking at skeletal frames. Believe it or not, this became an obsession with this kind of anthropological science in the 19th century. Lo and behold, after decades of searching, the most well-respected experts on the concept of race started to find that the skeletons, the skulls of Europeans, interestingly, are bigger than those of Africans and others. And so they kept taking measurements of these dead bodies, these skulls, and they would find systematically that Europeans generally, all things being equal, had larger skulls, which presumably means that they have larger brains, which presumably means that they're smarter or more capable of civilization. And this was revolutionary. This is progress. This is science. So here we have these people right here, the Europeans, having a scientific, natural foundation and basis for this explanation that Thomas Jefferson was just superior to his slaves. There's just no other way of looking at it. It's not just culture. It's not just race. It's science. And so if what you call racism about the 19th century was really scientific. So it helped explain an image like this, which is might strike you as a little controversial. This is called the Highway of Human Progress. And you can see the images on the left are that of sort of higher, complicated primates, gorillas and humanoids that eventually, as you look towards the middle, start to look more like Homo sapiens, and off to the right, you start to see what looks like a Homo sapien, a European, Western-looking kind of man, right? So there are a lot of problems with that, and sort of how that frames these images, of course, as you see. But you see this kind of use of evolutionary science that seems to support this. It goes one step further from the exploration of skulls to looking not just at superficial things like skin and culture and language, but also the skulls and now the skeletal structure. We start to see humanoids that look more European as more fully erect, more straight postured people, taller, higher foreheads, and things like that. And this is where we get the term highbrow from. If you've ever heard that phrase, I don't know if we use it very much anymore, but highbrow and lowbrow. Highbrow meant more advanced, and there's some sort of structural, physiological reason why certain people are more advanced than others as a group, as a race. And so really what we're looking at here over the course of the 19th century was this idea of progress, of science. These are advanced things, right? We like to think of civilization as going forward, of advancing. And so what that means is, if you're closer to the left side of that screen, if you look a little bit closer, if you're acting ape-like, if you look ape-like, if you are darker skinned, furrier, lower browed, what that means is, frankly, you're old school, right? The future is in advancement, in getting taller, thinner, balder, and more European. And this is what I wanted to say before we go any further, is everything I've been telling you is only partially true. Yes, it was scientific in the sense that they gathered evidence, there were peer-reviewed journals, people were scrutinizing this information. This is not the purview of small-minded fringe groups who were intent to destroy people who didn't look like them. These were oftentimes led by presidents, professors, scientists who were intent on finding out the truth of what it means to be a human being, because that's an important question to ask. So there's some truth to that it's scientific. It does look at these profound questions from a progressive standpoint, but it's a misappropriation. They're asking the wrong questions, and they're actually leaving off a lot of good, vital information that is scientific. So it took us a century, a whole century, way into the 20th century, when we see the worst sort of implementation of these kind of science or pseudosciences in, say, the Holocaust, and some really, really terrible sort of applications of this pseudoscience that we started to ask serious questions about the scientific nature of these beliefs. So what masqueraded as science for about a century really turned out to be profoundly not science. It was borrowing and abusing science. And it took real scientists to really scrutinize. And so just if I could just have a little sidebar here and mention this, this is one of the great things about science, is that the truth always wins out. It doesn't always win out in one generation or two, but if you use the scientific method, you will start to find accurate data. It might take a long time, and in this case it took at least a century and a half for really good, well-meaning scientists to start kind of reevaluating the questions that they were asking and the methods that they were using. Well, anyway, all that to say that this idea of white superiority for generations of Americans was not, again, a kind of small-minded fringe mentality. It was really integrated even at the highest levels. Woodrow Wilson was just a notable racist. I mean, I don't use that term lightly, but by the standards we would use today to define what racism is, we could really clearly apply that to this man. And this is a man who, very erudite professor, well-respected. And I'm not saying anything about his politics or anything like that, just he is a good example of a really good, smart person who was basing a lot of his beliefs on tradition, but also on science. And so there's some terrible ramifications for many Americans and many people around the world because of that. So now that we've mentioned that, one of the things I wanted to do is just pause right here. I'm going to go to another video here, and we're going to start to pick up where we left off, and we're going to go headlong into the sort of constitutional issues and the sort of historical overview of some of these Supreme Court cases and major American events that we're going to be taking a look at. So thank you, and we'll see you in the next video. Thank you.